The wagon wheel dropped into a rut, jolting Miriam's teeth together so hard she tasted copper. She did not complain. She just pulled the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and stared at the horizon. It was the same horizon she had been staring at for 2 days since the deputy left her at the edge of Laramie's town limits. A flat gray line where the sky met the dirt. Wyoming territory was not a place for green things. It was a place of wind and rock and endless, biting dust that worked its way into your clothes and the creases of your eyes. The man driving the wagon, a sour-faced hand named Jeb, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "That is it. Haskins' place." Miriam looked. It was not much, just a low-slung ranch house squatting against the plains, a leaning barn, and a bunkhouse that looked like it might fall over in the next strong gust. A few gaunt cattle milled near a frozen trough. "She is expecting you," Jeb said. He did not offer a hand as Miriam climbed stiffly down from the wagon bed. Widow Haskins stood on the porch. She was a woman carved from the same hard material as the land, her face a map of sun-scorched wrinkles. She looked Miriam up and down, taking in the mended dress, the exhaustion, and the stubborn set of her jaw. "You are the one from Laramie," the widow stated. It was not a question. "I am Miriam," she said, her voice hoarse from the dust. "I heard what they call you." Widow Haskins's eyes were flat. "I do not care. I am not the Lord, and I do not judge souls. I need a pair of hands. You work, you get a roof and scraps. You steal, you get left on the plains. You make trouble with my men, and I will have you horsewhipped. Understand?" "I understand," Miriam said. Trouble was the last thing she wanted. She just wanted to stop moving. "Jeb, show her the shed." The shed was a small shack, barely 10 feet square, that leaned against the windbreak trees behind the main house. It had been a tack room or perhaps a smokehouse long ago. The wood was warped, and the wind whistled through the gaps. Inside, there was a straw-stuffed mattress on a low frame, a rusted pail, and a small, pot-bellied stove that looked like it had not been lit in a decade. "It ain't much," Jeb grunted. "It is fine." Miriam dropped her small carpet bag on the floor. "Wash tubs are behind the kitchen. Cook stove fires are lit at 4 in the morning. Widow expects biscuits and gravy for the hands by 5:30. You miss it. You do not eat." He left, and Miriam was alone. She sat on the edge of the cot. The straw rustled beneath her. She pressed a hand to the floorboards. They were loose. As she ran her fingers along the gap, she heard a dry, rattling sound from beneath the floor. A rattlesnake, coiled up for the winter. Miriam pulled her hand back, but she did not panic. She just felt a deep, weary acknowledgement. Of course there were snakes. The world was full of them. She lay back on the thin mattress, too tired to even brush the dust from her dress, and fell into a hard, cold sleep. Survival, she knew, was just exhausting. She was given the laundry and the cook stove, and the work was brutal. The dawn came not as a light, but as a deeper shade of cold. Her hands were the first casualty. They went from the scalding lye water of the wash tubs to the freezing air as she hung the men's long johns and rough shirts on the line. The wind snapped the wet cloth like a bullwhip, stinging her face. Her skin cracked open and bled into the soap suds. After the laundry, she moved to the kitchen, hauling wood for the massive stove, peeling potatoes until her fingers cramped, and scrubbing pots coated in grease. She ate what was left after the half-dozen hands and the widow had finished, usually just the gravy-soaked bottom of a biscuit or the gristle end of the salt pork. It was, as promised, scraps, but it was food. She saw the other hands at meals. They were rough men, loud and smelling of horses and sweat. They looked at her. Some looked with pity, some with a crude curiosity. Miriam met their eyes with a look so sharp and flat it sent them back to their plates. And then there was Luke. She saw him on her second day. He was not in the bunkhouse with the others. He worked apart, handling the horses. He was tall, and he moved with a noticeable limp. dragging his left leg just slightly. But it was his face that held her. The right side was ordinary enough, weathered and dark, with a steady eye. The left side was a ruin, a mass of thickened, pulled scar tissue, slick and pale, that ran from his hairline down past his jaw. It looked like old wax, melted and hardened. It pulled the corner of his eye and his mouth into a permanent downward slant. He was a man of two halves, one quiet, one terrible. He did not speak, not to the widow, not to Jeb, not to anyone. He just worked. He had a way with the horses, a low murmur and a quiet hand that settled the skittish ones. He seemed to prefer their company. Miriam, out of a lifetime of painful habit, decided to test him. She was hauling the coffee pot out to the porch where the men were taking their morning break. Luke was standing off by himself, staring at the sick cattle herd, his scarred profile turned toward her. Miriam walked straight up to him. The other men fell silent, watching. "You look like you need this more than they do," she said, her voice intentionally low and rough, the voice she used when she wanted to provoke. She held the pot up. Luke turned. He looked at her. His good eye was clear, the color of gunmetal. He looked at her face, then down at the pot, then back to her face. She was ready for the flinch, the quick disgust. She was ready for the nervous look away, or even the greedy narrowing of the eyes that the other men gave her. He gave her nothing. His expression did not change. The scarred side was immobile, and the good side simply observed her as if she were a piece of furniture, or perhaps just a strange insect. He didn't take the coffee. He just turned, his limp pronounced in the dirt, and walked back toward the stables. The other men snickered. Miriam felt a hot flush of anger, but beneath it was something else, a strange chill. He had not just ignored her. He had dismissed her. He had looked at her and seen nothing worth reacting to. The cold settled in for good. The dawns were frostbitten, the air so thin and sharp it hurt to breathe. Miriam stuffed rags into the cracks of her shack, but the wind always found a way in. She took to hoarding wood scraps, building a small fire in the little stove just to keep her fingers from turning blue. Some nights, the cold was too deep to sleep. It was on one of those nights, when the moon was a sliver of ice in the black sky, that she saw him. She had been staring out her one small, grime-covered window, watching the stable. She was restless. She heard a noise from the bunkhouse, the sound of rough laughter and a bottle smashing. A moment later, the bunkhouse door opened, and Luke stepped out. He did not go to the outhouse. He just stood for a moment, looking up at the sky. Then, purposefully, he walked to the stable, his limp clear in the moonlight. He slipped inside and did not come out. Miriam watched for nearly an hour. He did not return to the bunkhouse. She pulled her shawl on and slipped out of her shack. The cold hit her like a hammer. She moved quietly, keeping to the shadows, until she reached the stable wall. It was warmer in here, the air thick with the smell of hay and animal breath. She found a gap in the boards. Luke was not sleeping in an empty stall. He was sitting on a hay bale near a sorrel mare, his head leaning against the horse's warm flank. His eyes were closed. He looked almost peaceful, if such a word could apply to a face like his. He was avoiding the bunkhouse. He preferred the company of animals in the freezing dark to a cot near the other men. Miriam shivered, and it was not just from the cold. She wondered what he was hiding from, or what the other men were hiding from in him. She got her answer, or part of it. 2 days later, she was kneading dough in the kitchen, her hands covered in flour. Jeb and another hand, a young boy named Charlie, were mending tack by the stove, taking advantage of the warmth. They spoke as if she were not there. "He gives me a chill, that one," Charlie said, his voice low. "Luke," Jeb grunted. "He works hard, leaves the rest of us alone. That is all I care about." "But the way he is," Charlie insisted. "And the stories. You hear them?" "I hear a lot of stories." "They say he got that face in the war. But Silas, who rode with him from Missouri, told me different, said it happened after the war, said Luke got in a card game back in Sedalia, accused a man of cheating. Charlie leaned in. Silas said Luke did not even raise his voice. He just stood up, and the other man pulled a pistol. Luke took it from him, broke his arm, and then he just killed him, strangled him with his bare hands while the whole saloon watched. That is talk, boy, Jeb said, but he looked uneasy. Silas said Luke never said a word, just finished his drink and walked out. No one knows where the scars came from. Some say the man's family caught him later. Some say it was something else entirely. But he killed a man, Jeb, and he does not sleep where we sleep. Miriam kept kneading the dough. Her arms ached, but she did not stop. A killer, a man who preferred horses to people, a man who looked at her and felt nothing. It made a dark, terrible kind of sense. The isolation of the ranch wore on her. It had been weeks since she had seen anyone besides the widow and the hands. When Widow Haskins told her to ride with Jeb into Laramie for supplies, Miriam felt a knot of dread. Laramie was where she had been cast out. But the widow needed feed sacks and salt, and Miriam needed thread. Her only good dress had ripped at the seam, and the cold wind was finding the tear. The town was just as she remembered, dusty, gray, and full of judgmental eyes. While Jeb loaded the wagon, Miriam slipped into the general store, her few coins clutched in her hand. The store was warm and smelled of cinnamon and coffee beans. Mrs. Davies, the pastor's wife, was at the counter, sorting ribbons. She was a large woman who wore her piety like armor. Miriam waited, keeping her eyes down. When the storekeep was free, she stepped forward. "Just a spool of brown thread, please," she murmured. "Mrs." Davies looked up. Her face, which had been smiling at the ribbons, hardened. "Well, look what the wind blew in." The storekeep froze. "We heard you had found employ out at the Haskins place." "Mrs." Davies said, her voice loud enough for the other customers to hear. "I suppose even God's wayward creatures need feeding." Miriam just held out her coin. "The thread, please." "We do not serve your kind here." "Mrs." Davies said, stepping between Miriam and the counter. "This is a respectable establishment, for decent folk, not for women of your reputation." The air went thin. Miriam could feel the stares. She felt the old, familiar shame creeping up her neck like hot water. "I am just trying to buy thread, ma'am." "Your presence soils this place," the woman snapped. "You are unclean. Go on, get out. Go back to the dirt where you belong." Miriam's hand trembled. She wanted to say something sharp, something that would cut, but the words died in her throat. She was just tired. She looked at the storekeep, who was busy wiping an already clean counter. No help there. She turned to leave, and she saw him. Luke was standing in the back corner of the store, a heavy sack of grain already resting on his good shoulder. He had been there the whole time. He had watched it all. His face was stone. His good eye met hers across the room. He did not speak. He did not move to defend her. He just watched, his expression unreadable, scarred and whole. Miriam broke his gaze first. She fled the store, climbing into the wagon and hiding her face in her hands so Jeb would not see the hot, angry tears. That night, the shack felt colder than ever. The humiliation in the store had stripped something vital from her. She had been called a harlot before. She had been called worse. But to be called unclean while trying to buy something as simple as thread, it made her feel like she was not even human. She was huddled under her thin blankets, shivering, when she heard a sound. A single footstep on her small, rickety porch. It was heavy and dragged slightly. She froze. It was not Jeb. It was not Charlie. She knew that limp. She heard the step retreat. She waited, her heart pounding, until the silence of the wind was the only sound. Slowly, she got up and cracked open the door. On the rough plank of the porch, sitting alone in the moonlight, was a small, wooden spool of brown thread. There was no note. There was nothing else. She snatched it up and brought it inside, closing the door and leaning against it. She held the spool in her hand. It was real. It was plain. It was exactly what she had asked for. He had seen her shame. He had not spoken, but he had returned, bought what she was denied, and left it at her door. He asked for nothing. He offered nothing but the thread itself. Miriam sank onto her cot, the spool held tight in her fist. She did not cry. She just stared at the wall. The next morning, she was at the wash tub before the sun. As she worked, she found herself watching the stable. She watched him move, that quiet, broken limp. She watched him gentle a new Mustang, his scarred face close to the animal's, his voice a low rumble she could not hear. He was still a brute. He was still a killer. Maybe he was still the man who had ignored her. But he was also the man who had left the thread. She found herself watching him from her small window as she tried to warm her shack in the evenings. She was drawn to his silence, because it was no longer an empty silence. It was a silence that saw things. She held the spool of thread, running her thumb over it. She needed to mend her dress, but the simple object felt heavy. It reminded her of other things. She remembered her father, a preacher, a man whose voice boomed with righteousness on Sunday and cracked like a whip at home. She remembered being 14, sitting in the front pew, the air thick with brimstone. A boy 2 rows back, Silas Miller's son, had caught her eye and smiled. She had smiled back, just a flicker. Her father had seen. He had not spoken on the walk home. He waited until they were in the root cellar. He had used a hickory switch, telling her with each strike that she was inviting sin, that the smile of a woman was the gateway for the devil. She remembered the beatings, and she remembered, a year later, when her father had brought Mr. Gideon home, a man of 50, with a wet cough and hands that were never still. "You will be married," her father had declared. "It is a biblical marriage, to a good, righteous man. He will tame the wickedness in you." She had been sold, not for money, but for the sake of her soul. Miriam ran her thumb over the thread Luke had left. She had run from Mr. Gideon. She had run from her father. She had been running ever since, from town to town, taking what work she could, earning the reputation that now preceded her. She looked out the window again. Luke was crossing the yard, heading for the stable, avoiding the bunkhouse. He was a man covered in scars. She was a woman covered in different ones. He was hiding in the stable. She was hiding in this shack. Miriam watched him until he disappeared into the darkness, and for the first time since she arrived, she did not feel entirely alone in the cold. The sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, and then it opened. It was not a gentle snow. It was a howling, white fury that came sideways, erasing the horizon, the barn, and then the path to the outhouse. The wind screamed, a high, thin sound that got inside the walls and inside your head. For 3 days, it did not stop. The world shrank to the inside of the Haskins ranch house. On the 4th day, the snow stopped, but the cold deepened, settling over the land like a shroud. The drifts were piled 10 feet high against the bunkhouse. The supply routes were gone. Laramie was on the other side of the moon. Widow Haskins gathered the hands. Her face was grim. "We are cut off. We have got flour and salt pork for maybe 3 weeks. If we are smart, hay is low, we ration everything. Half rations for the hands. Quarter rations for the cattle that are left. We lose the herd. We lose the ranch." Survival, which had been exhausting, now became a desperate, quiet fight. The days were spent digging paths from the house to the stable, and from the stable to the dwindling hayrick. The cold was a physical enemy. It leached the warmth from your bones. Miriam's work doubled, with the men weak and reserving their strength for the cattle. She was responsible for all the wood, all the water, which meant melting snow, and all the cooking. The scraps she lived on became scraps of scraps. The gnawing hunger in her belly was a constant companion. second only to the cold. She pushed herself, fueled by a stubborn anger that had kept her alive this long. She would not be the one to break. One afternoon, the wind had picked up again, spinning icy tornadoes of ground snow across the yard. The woodpile was nearly gone. She was hauling her third load, the rough-cut logs piled high in her arms. She was dizzy. The hunger and the cold had made the world feel thin and distant. She took a step toward the kitchen door and her boot slipped on a patch of ice. She did not just fall. She collapsed. The wood scattered. She tried to push herself up, but her arms had no strength. The snow was soft, almost warm. It would be so easy to just lie there, just close her eyes for a minute. The thought was as seductive as a lover's whisper. She heard a boot crunch in the snow, heavy, dragging. Luke. He stood over her, a dark shape against the blinding white. He looked down, his face a mask of scar tissue and wind-burned skin. Miriam tried to say something sharp, to tell him to go away, but her lips were numb. "Cannot," she managed to whisper. He did not speak. He knelt, and with one swift, practiced motion, he slid his arms under her, one beneath her back, one under her knees, and lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her not to the main house, but to her shack. It was closer. He kicked the door open and set her down on the thin cot. The cabin was as cold as the air outside. He left. She thought he was gone for good, but he returned a minute later with a handful of kindling and 2 split logs from his own armload. He knelt at the pot-bellied stove, his back to her. She watched his hands, large and chapped, as he skillfully laid the fire. He struck a match and tended the small flame until it caught, turning the rusted iron of the stove warm. Then he turned to her. Miriam was shaking, a violent, bone-deep shudder she could not control. Her hands, left bare where her mittens had torn, were white and stiff. Luke looked at her hands. He sat on the floor, took her right hand between both of his. His touch was not gentle. It was firm, solid. His hands were rough as cured leather and hot as the stove itself. He held her frozen hand, wrapping his fingers around it, engulfing it. He began to rub, hard, forcing the blood back into the numb flesh. It was agony. It felt like needles, like fire. Miriam gasped and tried to pull away. "No," he said. It was the first word he had ever spoken to her. Not a shout, just a low, rough command. He did not let go. He just kept rubbing, his good eye fixed on her hand, his scarred mouth set in a grim line. He worked on one hand, then the other, until the white turned a painful, blotchy red, and she could feel her own pulse again. He finished. He stood up, towering in the small room. He looked at her, huddled on the cot, and she looked back at him. She, the woman they called a harlot. He, the man they called a killer. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the new fire and the howl of the wind. He gave a single curt nod, and then he was gone. Miriam stared at the door. Her hands throbbed, but they were her hands again. He had saved them. He had saved her from the snow. And he had spoken. She fell into a feverish sleep, the sudden warmth of the stove and the deep chill in her bones fighting a war inside her. She drifted. She was not in Wyoming. She was back in that dusty room with Mr. Gideon, his wet cough, his hands. And then she was running. She was running through a field, and a man was calling her name. "Paul!" she cried out, her voice thin in the dark shack. "Paul, they will see!" She woke with a start. Luke was standing just inside the door, a tin cup of broth in his hand. The steam rose in the cold air. He had brought her part of his own ration. He had heard her. She knew it. She saw it in the stillness of his good eye. He had heard the name. He did not ask. He just set the cup on the floor beside her cot and left, pulling the door shut against the wind. The storm held them captive for another week. When the skies finally cleared, the world was a changed place. It was buried, silent, and glittering. and the work of survival began again. The shared misery and the forced closeness had changed things. The other hands, Jeb and Charlie, spoke to her now. They shared tobacco. They cursed the cold as equals. But with Luke, the silence was different. It was no longer empty. It was full of things unsaid. The thread, the rescue, the name Paul. They began to exist in the same space. She no longer avoided the stable. He no longer walked away when she entered the kitchen. They had found a strange, unspoken truce. One afternoon, she was boiling the last of the tough salt pork when Luke came into the kitchen, his limp more pronounced than usual. He was bleeding. "You are hurt," she said. It was a flat statement. He ignored her, moving to the sink to pump water over a nasty gash on his forearm. "That new Mustang?" she asked. He just grunted, his face tight with pain as the cold water hit the raw flesh. "You will poison your blood that way," Miriam said, exasperated. She dried her hands on her apron and went to the small cupboard where Widow Haskins kept carbolic and bandages. "Sit down. Do not be a fool." He looked like he might refuse, but the fight went out of him. He was tired. He sat at the kitchen table, the blood dripping onto the floor. Miriam came back and stood beside him. "Give it here." She took his arm. It was thick with muscle, the skin covered in fine, dark hair. She cleaned the wound, her touch practical, almost rough. He hissed as the carbolic stung, but he did not pull away. As she worked, her fingers brushed the inside of his wrist, near the scar tissue. His skin was hot. She wrapped the bandage, her movements quick. "You are lucky it missed the bone." "It was not the horse," he said, his voice a low rumble. She paused, her hands still on the knot. "What?" "The horse threw me. I landed on the harrow, rusted." She finished the knot and looked at his face. He was looking at her, really looking, for the first time. His good eye was intent, searching. "You have got a steady hand," he said quietly. "I have had practice," she said, her voice turning hard again. She pulled her hands away. As she turned to put the supplies away, her dress shifted. The movement pulled the high collar of her worn wool dress to the side, exposing the back of her neck and the top of her shoulder blade. Luke went still. She felt his gaze on her back, as sharp as a touch. She did not need to ask what he saw. She knew. The scars were old, pale, and thick, a crisscross pattern of raised white lines from her father's hickory switch. They covered her back, from her shoulders to her waist. She turned back to him. He was not looking at her face. He was looking at her shoulder, where the white lines disappeared under her collar. His expression was one she had never seen before. It was not pity. It was a dark, terrible recognition. He knew what those marks were, just as she knew, without asking, that the slick, melted wax of his face was from fire. He stood up, his chair scraping the floor. He did not say thank you. He just walked out of the kitchen, his limp heavy. Miriam leaned against the counter, her heart hammering. He had seen her, the part she kept hidden, the part that misses. Davies in town had sensed. The unclean part. She tried to joke about it the next day. She found him by the woodpile, splitting the last of the big logs. The axe rose and fell with a steady, powerful rhythm. She stood there until he finally stopped, resting the axe head on the block. "You are getting a habit of this," she said, forcing a lightness into her voice. He just looked at her, breathing hard, sweat trickling from his good side. "Saving me," she pushed. "First my hands, then my reputation. Now I save your arm. You are becoming my silent guardian. Mr. Luke." She meant it as a tease, a way to break the tension that now sparked between them like static. But he did not smile. The scarred side of his face was impassive, but his good eye darkened. He leaned the axe against the block and spoke, his voice low and bitter, laced with a gravelly self-hatred that stunned her. You do not want to be guarded by me." He walked away, leaving her standing by the woodpile, the failed joke hanging in the frozen air. The words echoed in her head. "You do not want to be guarded by me." It was not a warning, it was a confession. That night, she could not sleep. She understood his silence now. He was not just quiet, he was in exile. He was not just a killer, he was a man who believed he was poison. She learned the truth of it, not from the whispers of the men, but from his own nightmares. The storm had forced him from the stable. The cold was too much, and the horses needed the shelter more. He had taken a cot in the corner of the kitchen, near the stove, the farthest point from the bunkhouse. Miriam, in her shack, could not hear him, but one night, fetching water, she heard it through the kitchen door, a low, strangled moan. She pushed the door open. He was on his cot, his whole body rigid, his good hand clenched at his side. "No," he breathed. "Get him out! Jebby, get him out!" He was dreaming. He was not in Wyoming. He was somewhere else, somewhere with fire. Miriam found herself thinking of a fire, of a story she had dismissed. Some say the man's family caught him later. Luke had not been burned by an angry family. He had been burned in a war. She remembered the talk of Union soldiers, of Missouri. She saw it, then, not a saloon, but a barn, not a card game, but a raid. Union soldiers, torches, and a barn set ablaze. Luke, a younger man, his face whole. He tries to get in. The flames beat him back. The heat sears his skin, melts his face. And inside, someone screams. Jebby, his younger brother. He had not just lost his face in that fire, he had lost his brother. And he blamed himself. He had not been a guardian. He had failed. You do not want to be guarded by me. The tension on the ranch became thick and heavy. Luke avoided her now, his shame and his self-loathing a wall between them. But Miriam found she could not let it be. He had seen her scars. She had heard this broken, silent man was the only person on earth who knew her, and she knew him. She pushed, not because she wanted him, but because she needed to feel something other than the cold and the hunger and the endless aching loneliness. She needed to see a flicker of life in his deadened eyes, even if it was anger. One night, the wind had died down. The other hands were in the bunkhouse, the widow in her room. Luke was sitting at the kitchen table, where he had taken to mending harnesses, his scarred profile stark in the lamplight. Miriam came in from her shack. She did not light another lamp. She just walked over to the stove and stood by it, soaking in the meager warmth. He did not look up. He just kept working, his large hands pulling the leather taut. She watched him. The silence was louder than the wind had ever been. "You are afraid of me," she said. His hand stopped. He did not look at her. "No." "Yes, you are." She moved, standing in front of him, blocking his light. "You are afraid because I am the only one here who is not afraid of you." He finally raised his head. His good eye was dark. "Go to bed, Miriam." "You think you are a monster," she whispered, her voice rough. "You think that face in that story from Missouri makes you something terrible. You want to hide in the stable and live with the horses because you think you are an animal." "Stop it," he said. The word was a low growl. She did not stop. She was reckless, dancing on the edge of something she did not understand. She was tired of being handled like she was broken. She wanted to break something. She leaned in, her face close to his. She could smell the soap and leather on his skin. "You want control?" she teased, her voice a low, taunting drawl. The words she had used on other men she despised, to see them puff up with false power. He froze. It was not the reaction she expected. He did not get angry. He did not sneer. He just stopped breathing. His good eye widened, and in it she saw a flash of pure, bottomless terror. She had meant to provoke him. Instead, she had terrified him. The game changed. This was not a game. Slowly, she reached out and took his right hand. It was calloused, stiff. He let her take it. as if he were paralyzed. She lifted it, and she saw it. His hand was trembling, violently. She guided his hand. She did not place it on her chest or on her waist. She placed it on her thigh, just above the knee, on the rough wool of her dress. He didn't move it. He didn't snatch it away. He didn't grab her. He just sat there, frozen, his entire arm shaking, his breath coming in short, hitched gasps. He stared at his own hand on her leg as if he had just watched it murder someone. The tension in the room was unbearable. It was not desire. It was something far more raw. It was the tension of a rope pulled so tight it was singing, right before it snaps. He made a sound, a low, strangled noise in the back of his throat. And then he broke. He snatched his hand back, not to strike her, but to cover his face. His broad shoulders began to heave. He bent forward, his head bowed, and the first sob tore out of him. It was not a weep. It was a dry, racking sound of a man who had not cried in a decade, a man who had forgotten how. Miriam stared, her taunt dissolving in her mouth. The killer from Missouri, the man who strangled another man with his bare hands, was weeping at her touch. He was not a monster. He was just a man, terrified of his own strength, starved for a touch he believed he did not deserve. All the fight went out of her, all the hardness. She did not see a brute. She saw the boy who had failed to save his brother from the fire. She did not coo or soothe. She did not offer empty words of comfort. She just sat on the bench beside him and, after a long moment, she put one hand on his shaking back. He flinched, a violent shudder, but he did not pull away. Instead, he leaned into her touch, like a starving animal. He turned, and before she could react, he buried his ruined face against her shoulder, his arms wrapping around her waist, clutching her like a drowning man. His whole body shook. He wept. He wept for Jebby. He wept for his face. He wept for the years of silence and self-hatred. Miriam froze, and then, slowly, she raised her arms and held him. She held this broken, scarred man in the dim kitchen. She held him as he fell apart in her arms, his hot tears soaking the shoulder of her dress. She held him, her own pain, her own past, her own scars, all fading into the background, replaced by the staggering, impossible weight of his. How long they sat there, she did not know. The fire in the stove burned low, and the kitchen grew cold. Finally, the sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. He did not move for a long time. Then, slowly, he pulled away. He could not look at her. The shame rolling off him was a palpable thing. He stood up, wiping his good eye with the back of his hand. He looked at the floor, at the wall, at anything but her. He did not say a word. He just turned, his limp heavy and pronounced, and walked to the kitchen door. He opened it, letting in a blast of freezing air, and disappeared into the night. Miriam sat alone at the table. She did not move. She felt hollowed out, shaken to her very bones. Outside, in the new, sharp cold, a pack of coyotes began to howl. It was a lonely, grieving sound that echoed across the snow. Inside, in the silence, Miriam touched her shoulder, still damp from his tears. Neither of them spoke of what happened. They did not have the words for it. The thaw came not as a relief, but as a new kind of misery. The world, which had been clean and white and silent, turned to a churning sea of brown mud. The snow melted, revealing the gaunt corpses of cattle that had frozen in the drifts. The wind still blew, but now it carried the wet, heavy scent of decay for Miriam and Luke. The silence that had fallen after that night in the kitchen was heavier than the snow had been. They moved around each other with a kind of careful, aching politeness. He fixed the latch on her door. She saved him a piece of bread from her own meager portion. They never spoke of it. They could not. The memory of his weeping, of her holding him, was too raw. It was a shared wound, and neither knew how to tend it. They were in their third week of isolation when the rider appeared. a dark speck moving slowly across the mud-soaked plains. He was the first new human they had seen in almost a month. He was a mail carrier from Laramie, his horse breathing hard, its flanks slick with mud. He brought letters for the widow and news of the town. Miriam was in the kitchen, scrubbing a pot, but she kept the door ajar, hungry for the sound of an outside voice. "It was a terrible winter," the mailman said, stamping mud from his boots on the porch. Widow Haskins gave him a cup of coffee. "Town is near starved, but things are moving again. A federal judge came in on the train, and a man, a Mr. Gideon, looking for his wife." Miriam's hand froze in the pot. The scouring cloth went still. "Oh?" the widow said, her voice sharp with interest. "Aye, a real pious man, from back east. Says his wife ran off, took a good bit of his money. He has got a warrant for her arrest. Theft. He has been asking every man in every saloon. Hired a few riders to check the outlying ranches." The mailman took a sip of coffee. "Seems she was last seen heading this way. A woman alone." Miriam did not breathe. It was him. Her father's biblical choice. Mr. Gideon. He had not let her go. He had followed her, and he had come with the power of the law. A false warrant. He would drag her back. She heard the widow's chair scrape. "A woman alone, you say?" "That is the story. Name of Miriam. Miriam Gideon. You have not seen anyone like that, have you?" Miriam heard the long, cold pause. "No," Widow Haskins said, her voice flat. "No one like that here. Just the hands. Finish your coffee. Mr. Tate, you have got a long ride back." Miriam leaned against the wall, her heart a cold stone in her chest. The widow had lied for her. The flicker of hope was brief. When the rider was gone, the widow came into the kitchen. Her face was set in hard, practical lines. "You heard," she said. Miriam nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "You brought this trouble to my door, girl. I lied for you, because I will not have that kind of man on my property. But I will not lie to the law." The widow untied her apron. "A warrant. Scandal. I am a lone woman, and my name is all I have. I cannot have it soiled. You will pack your things." "Where can I go?" Miriam whispered, the words ragged. "He will find me." "That is not my concern," the widow said, though her eyes held a flicker of something close to pity. "You have got 1 hour. Jeb will be back from the south pasture. I will tell him to look the other way. You be gone before he returns." "You are just going to throw her out?" Both women turned. Luke was standing in the yard, just outside the kitchen door. He must have been listening. His face was dark, the scar tissue pulling tight in the cold. "This is not your affair. Luke," the widow snapped. "You throw her out. She is dead," Luke said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air. "That man will find her before sundown." "And what of it?" The widow's fear made her cruel. "She is what she is. She brought this on herself. A woman who curses the land she walks on." Miriam flinched, the word striking her like a blow. Luke flinched, too. He stared at the widow, and in his good eye, she saw the murder they all whispered about. But he did not move. He just looked at her, then turned his gaze on Miriam. The anger faded, replaced by something else, a bleak understanding. He turned and walked away, his limp heavy in the mud. Miriam went to her shack. She was not crying. She was beyond tears. She sat on the cot. 1 hour. She could run to the hills, but the snow was still deep. She could try for Laramie, but he was there. It was over. She had run for 2 years, and he had finally caught her. The door of the shack opened, filling the small space with his shadow. Luke did not enter. He just stood in the frame. He was holding a small leather pouch. "She is right, you know," Miriam said, her voice dead. She stared at the floorboards, at the crack where the rattlesnake lived. "I am a curse. I bring ruin to everyone. My father, Mr. Gideon, this ranch." You—" "No," he said. He stepped inside, and the shack felt impossibly small. He held out the pouch. It jingled. "I have got money saved," he said, his voice low and fast. "From the cattle drive. Before I came here. It is not much. $90. It is enough to get to Colorado. I have got a cousin who works the mines near Silverton." She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Colorado? It is not Wyoming. It is not Laramie. It is away. We can get you away from him." Miriam stared at him. The man who hid in stables, the man who wept in her arms, the man who had seen her scars and not turned away, and all she could feel was the sting of his pity. "I do not need your pity. Luke!" she spat, the old, sharp anger returning. "I am not a lame horse for you to save. I will not be another one of your failures. You did not want to be my guardian, remember?" The words hit him. She saw him recoil, saw the raw pain in his good eye. The old Luke, the one who ignored her by the coffee pot, would have turned and left. This man did not. He stood there, taking her anger. He fisted his hands, then unclenched them. He was struggling, fighting for words he did not know how to use. "It is not pity," he finally said, the words torn from him. I do not know what it is, but it is not pity." He looked at his own scarred hand, then at her. "All my life since the fire people look at me. They see the monster. They see the man from Missouri. They see the ruin." He finally met her gaze, and his was raw and honest and desperate. You looked at me, and you were not afraid. You were the only one who ever looked at me like I was not ruined." The air left her lungs. He was not offering to save her. He was offering to join her. He was just as ruined as she was. She was quiet for a long time, the only sound the steady drip of melting snow from the roof. "If I go," she said, her voice hard, testing him, "it is not as anything. We are two travelers. That is all." He looked confused. "I do not understand." "You will not touch me," she said, the words sharp as glass. "You will not be my husband. You will not be my guardian. You will not touch me. Not unless I ask you to." It was a cruel thing to say, after what had passed between them. It was the only armor she had left. If this was about saving her, he would agree. If it was about owning her, he would balk. He looked at her, his face a mask of old pain. The memory of the kitchen, of her touch, was there in his eyes. He gave a single, jerking nod. "Unless you ask." He agreed. "Get the supplies," she said. Standing up, the fog of despair was gone, replaced by the cold, clear will to survive. "We leave at moonset. We will take the old buckboard." They fled at night. Luke harnessed his own horse, a strong bay, and the widow's calmest pack mule to the small, rattling buckboard. They loaded it with 2 saddles, the last of the hay, the salt pork, and every blanket Luke could steal from the bunkhouse. Miriam climbed onto the seat, her small bag at her feet. She did not look back at the shack. She did not look back at the ranch house. She just stared forward into the darkness. Luke clicked his tongue, and the wagon lurched forward, the wheels sucking at the mud. They were free. The freedom was brutal. The plains were not a place for a rickety wagon in a thaw. The mud was a constant enemy, a thick, cold sludge that tried to pull the wheels off. By day, the sun was a weak, watery thing that did nothing to warm them. By night, the temperature dropped, and the mud froze in sharp ridges, and a driving sleet began to fall. They took turns, one driving, one huddled under the wet blankets. They barely spoke. There was nothing to say. There was only the wind, the creak of the wagon, and the gnawing hunger. On the 4th day, they were trying to cross a half-frozen creek bed when it happened. The front wheel dropped into a hole hidden by icy water. There was a sharp, pistol-shot crack. The wagon slumped, tipping sideways. Luke jumped down into the freezing water. He ran his hand along the axle. He did not need to say anything. Miriam saw it. The axle was split clean through. They were stranded. Luke stared at it. His shoulders slumped. Defeat. Miriam looked around. They were in a shallow gully, miles from any tree, any shelter. "We cannot stay here," she said. They worked in the freezing water, unhitching the horse and the mule. They loaded the animals with what they could carry. 1 blanket each, the saddles, the last of the hardtack, and Luke's rifle. They abandoned the buckboard, and with it, their last hope of comfort. Now, the journey was on foot. They took turns riding the bay, but the horse was weakening, and the mud was too deep. They walked, leading the animals, their boots soaked, their feet numb. One night, they saw a campfire. They were desperate. Their food was gone. "We have to," Luke said. "We need food." They approached slowly. It was not a family. It was 5 rough-looking men, huddled around a fire, passing a bottle. They had rifles across their laps. They looked like ex-soldiers, the kind of men who drifted after the war, hunting bounties or just trouble. One of them saw Luke and Miriam in the firelight and stood up, leveling his rifle. "That is close enough." "We are just travelers," Luke said, his voice calm. He kept his hands away from his belt. "Heading for Colorado. We are out of food. We can pay." The men looked them over. They saw Luke's scarred face. They saw Miriam, her hair plastered to her head, her face gaunt with hunger. "Travelers, eh?" the leader said, a big man with a greasy beard. "What is your name?" "Friend." "Luke? Luke what?" The man squinted. "You look familiar. I know a man in Cheyenne looking for a fella with a face like yours. A fella who killed a man in Missouri?" Luke went rigid. Another man, younger, with mean eyes, was staring at Miriam. "And the woman, she your wife?" "She is with me," Luke said, his voice dropping to a low growl. Miriam saw where this was going. She saw the leering look, the way the men were shifting, their hands on their guns. She stepped forward, her chin up, forcing her voice to be steady. "He is my brother. We are meeting our father in Denver. Our wagon broke back at the fork." The men laughed. "Brother," the leader snorted. "He does not look like your kin, girl, and you are a sight too clean for this kind of travel." "We will just buy the food and go," Luke said, his hand slowly moving toward the knife at his belt. The leader saw the movement. He grinned, showing black teeth. "We ain't got food to sell. Now you get on before we decide to take that horse. And maybe the woman—" Luke did not move. He was ready to fight, ready to die. "Luke," Miriam said, her voice sharp. "Let us go. It is not worth it." She grabbed his arm, pulling him back. For a long second, he resisted. His body coiled. Then he let her pull him away. They backed into the darkness, then scrambled for the animals and moved as fast as they could, not stopping until the sun came up. They had escaped, but they were still hungry, and now they were hunted. The journey wore them down to bone and nerve. They slept huddled together under a single, wet blanket, back to back, but never truly touching. The promise she had extracted from him was a wall of ice between them. But the nights betrayed them. Miriam would cry out in her sleep. "No, please, Mr. Gideon, no," she whimpered, her hands clenched. Luke would lie awake beside her, his whole body rigid, his good eyes staring at the black sky. He wanted to reach for her. He wanted to tell her she was safe, but he had given his word. He just lay there, listening, his hands fisted at his sides, and he had his own ghosts. He would thrash, his legs kicking. "Jebby! The smoke, I cannot get him out!" His hand would reach for something that was not there. Miriam would wake, her heart pounding. She would watch him in the pale moonlight, his face a mask of old agony, the scar tissue slick and pale. She wanted to touch his face, to smooth the lines, but she did not. She just watched until his nightmares faded and his breathing evened out. They woke each morning, stiff and cold, the ghosts of the night still clinging to them. They never spoke of it. The daylight was for survival. They were near the Colorado border, in the high, cold foothills, when Luke managed to shoot a rabbit with his last bullet. They built a real fire that night, the first in days. They cooked the meat and ate, the hot food a shock to their starved bodies. The warmth, the full belly. It broke something loose. They sat by the fire. Luke was cleaning his knife, his face grim. Miriam was watching him. She was watching his hands. The hands that had saved her from the snow. The hands that had fisted in rage at the bounty hunters. The hands that trembled in his sleep. The hands that had killed a man. She stood up. He did not look up, just kept his focus on the blade. She unbuttoned her dress. The heavy, damp wool slid from her shoulders and pooled at her waist. Luke froze. He looked up. She was standing in her thin chemise, the firelight shining through the worn cloth, outlining her thin body. "Miriam," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing? You will freeze." She untied the ribbons of the chemise. She let it fall. She was bare to the waist, her skin pale in the firelight. Her ribs showed. And across her back, the fire illuminated the network of pale, raised scars. "I am tired of being cold," she said. She walked to him, where he sat on the ground. She knelt in the dirt in front of him. He was staring, not at her breasts, but at her face. He looked terrified. She took his right hand, the one holding the knife. She gently took the knife from his grip and tossed it aside. She held his hand. It was calloused, rough as a stone, and, just like in the kitchen, it was trembling. She lifted his hand. He let her, his arm rigid, his whole body shaking. She pressed his calloused palm flat against her bare chest, right over her heart. His hand was hot from the fire. Her skin was ice. She could feel his shaking, and he could feel the frantic, rabbit-fast beat of her heart. "I am not afraid of your hands," she whispered. He did not move. He just stared at his own hand on her skin, as if it were a foreign, dangerous thing. He looked at her face, his good eyes searching, asking a question he did not know how to voice. She leaned in and kissed him. It was not a soft kiss. It was chapped lips and wood smoke and 2 years of desperation. It was a claiming. His other hand, the left one, came up. The fingers were stiff from the cold. He touched her face, his thumb tracing her jaw. Hesitant. He was still afraid. Afraid of her, afraid of himself. She guided him. They moved to the blankets. It was not heat. It was not passion. It was a slow, trembling, aching discovery. It was two broken, ruined people, trying to find a whole piece. His fingers, impossibly gentle, traced the scars on her back. He stopped, as if he had hurt her. She had to take his hand and guide it back, showing him it was all right. She touched his face. She ran her fingers over the slick, ruined skin of his cheek. He flinched, a deep, full-body wince, and tried to turn his face away. "It is just skin, Luke," she whispered. She leaned in and kissed the scar. A sound tore from his throat, a low groan of surrender. The control he had held for years, the iron wall he had built around himself, shattered. He pulled her to him, and it was a joining not of bodies, but of pain. It was slow. It was awkward. It was full of questions and long-buried grief. It was the first human touch that either of them had truly, freely accepted in years. It was more relief than it was pleasure. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blankets. For the first time, there was no cold space between them. The fire was dying, and the high plains were silent. Miriam lay with her head on his chest, listening to his heart slow down. Luke stared up at the impossible number of stars. He spoke, his voice thick, rough. "That night, in the kitchen, when you said what you said, she knew you want control." He nodded, his chest moving beneath her. I thought you saw it, the animal in me. The thing I keep locked up. The thing that killed that man in Missouri. I thought you wanted it, and it terrified me." He stroked her hair, his hand still shaking, but less now. "It is not control I want," he said, and the words seemed to cost him everything. "It is to be wanted." Miriam felt a single, hot tear slide from the corner of her eye and drop onto his skin. It was not a tear for her. It was for him, for the years he had spent believing he was a monster. She lifted her head and looked at him. His face, one half in shadow, one half in starlight, whole and ruined. She kissed him, a long, slow kiss that tasted of salt and smoke. She gave him no other answer. It was not an answer he needed to hear. It was one he needed to be shown. They walked out of the high plains and into the borderlands, following a dry creek bed that led them to a small cluster of buildings huddled in a shallow valley. It was not much, just a trading post, a livery, a saloon, and a dozen small cabins. 3 creeks. It was not a town. It was a pause in the wilderness. But after what they had endured, it felt like a city. They were a hard sight. A gaunt, limping man with a terribly scarred face, and a woman who looked like a ghost, her dress in tatters, her eyes hollowed out by hunger and fear. The people who saw them arrive turned away, not from cruelty, but from a quiet respect for hardship. These were folks who understood what it meant to be at the end of your rope. Luke used the last of their money to rent a 1-room cabin on the edge of the settlement. It was barely more than Miriam's shack at the Haskins Ranch, but the roof did not leak, and it had a real bed. For the first 2 days, they mostly slept. They bought flour and beans on credit from the trading post, and Miriam made a thin stew. They ate in silence, the exhaustion so deep it left no room for words. The intimacy of the plains, the raw confession of that night, seemed a distant dream. Now, they were just 2 strangers under a roof, the reality of their situation settling in. On the 3rd day, Miriam washed her hair in the creek and put on her last clean, mended dress. She had to find work. She went to the trading post, but the man just shook his head. She tried the saloon, asking if they needed help in the kitchen. The bartender looked her up and down with a measuring eye that made her skin crawl, and she left before he could answer. She was standing by the livery, not sure what to do next, when a woman's voice, rich and warm as coffee, cut through the air. "You are not built for saloon work, child, and you are not built for starving, though you are giving it a fine try." Miriam turned. A black woman, tall and solid, was watching her from the porch of a small, neat cabin. She had a bright blue kerchief wrapped around her head, and her hands were busy braiding sweetgrass. She looked to be 50 or perhaps 70. Her face was kind, but her eyes were sharp, and they missed nothing. "I am looking for work, ma'am," Miriam said. "I see that. I also see you know how to hold yourself. Come inside. I am Delia." The cabin was one large room, but it was clean and warm and smelled of wood smoke and sage. The entire back wall was taken up with shelves of fabric, ribbons, buttons, and finished goods, shirts, dresses, quilts. A sign over the door, which Miriam had not noticed, read, "A. Delia, seamstress, fine mending and gowns." "They call me Aunt Delia," the woman said, gesturing to a stool. "Most folks here do. You know how to sew?" "I can," Miriam said, her voice quiet. My mother taught me, and I mended for the hands at the last place I worked." She held up her own hands, showing the calluses and the chapped skin. Aunt Delia nodded, a small hum in her throat. She looked at Miriam, not at her thinness, not at the haunted look in her eyes, but at her. "You have got good hands. Strong. I need help. The wives from the big ranches. They get the catalogs from back east. They want the new fashions. I cannot keep up. It is not much pay, but it is coin, and I will give you a square meal at midday." Miriam felt a stinging in her eyes. It was the first real kindness she had been offered, with no strings and no judgment, since she could remember. "Thank you," she whispered. "We start tomorrow," Aunt Delia said. "Now you go home. You look like a strong wind would break you in two." Miriam started working the next day. She sat in the warm, quiet room, the rhythm of the needle a comfort. Aunt Delia did not pry. She did not ask where Miriam had come to be in such a state. She just talked about the work, about the town, about which threads were strong and which were fickle. It was simple. It was peace. Luke, too, found his way. He went to the livery. The owner, a man named Silas, had a string of wild mustangs that no one could break. They were half-starved and mean as snakes. Miriam watched from the sewing shop window. She saw Luke walk into the corral. He did not carry a whip. He did not carry a rope. He just stood there, his hands loose at his sides. He let the horses scream and kick and run at him. He just moved, slow, limping, letting them get used to his shape, his smell. He was not a threat. He was just another broken thing, like them. By the end of the day, the lead mare was eating oats from his hand. Silas hired him on the spot. A new routine began. Luke would leave at dawn, his limp less pronounced now that he had a purpose. He would work all day in the sun, his low, rumbling voice a constant in the corrals. Miriam would sit with Aunt Delia, her fingers growing nimble, sewing fine stitches into taffeta and wool. Something in Luke began to uncoil. The man who had hidden in the stables, who had wept in her arms, began to heal. The work with the horses settled him. He was earning coin, real coin, for the first time in years. One evening, he came back to the cabin. Miriam was cooking. He was standing in the doorway, watching her, and she looked up. He was not smiling, not with his whole face, but the good side of his mouth was quirked up, and his eye was bright. "What is it?" she asked, a small defensiveness in her voice. "Silas, he paid me. He said I had a gift, that I was a horse whisperer. Damnedest fool thing I ever heard." He chuckled. It was a rough, unused sound, like a rusty hinge, but it was a laugh. Miriam stared at him. The sound of it was so unexpected. It startled her more than a gunshot would have. He was healing. He was finding his way back. But she was not. She worked. She ate. She spoke with Aunt Delia, but a part of her remained frozen. She was still on that plain, still listening for the sound of Mr. Gideon's riders. They slept in the same bed, but the promise she had extracted from him, not unless I ask, was still a wall between them. After that one night by the fire, she had not been able to ask again. And he, true to his word, never touched her. He would lie on his side of the bed, his back to her, his breathing steady. But she knew he was not asleep. The fear kept her separate. It was a cold, hard knot in her belly. One night, Luke woke from a bad dream. The old one. The fire. "Jebby!" He sat bolt upright, breathing hard, his good hand clenched. Miriam was awake. She was always awake. She almost reached for him. Her hand hovered in the dark space between them. She wanted to put her hand on his back, to offer him the same comfort he had found in her arms in the kitchen. But she could not. The moment she thought of touching him, of offering comfort, she saw Mr. Gideon's face. Luke's breathing steadied. He did not know she was awake. He lay back down, his back to her, and the moment was lost. She kept a knife under her pillow. It was a small, sharp skinning knife she had taken from the supplies. She had slipped it under the thin mattress when Luke was not looking. But Luke was a man who noticed things. One morning, he was adding a log to the fire. She was getting dressed, her back to him. She reached under the pillow to straighten the bedding, and her hand brushed the hilt of the knife. He saw it. He did not stop. He did not speak. He just added the log to the fire, his movements economical. But he saw it. He saw that she slept with a weapon. He saw that even after all this, even after he had saved her, even after they had been intimate, she was still afraid. She saw the new stillness in him. The laughter did not come as often. He was working harder, staying at the livery until full dark, the distance she had created. He was now respecting the wall she had built. He would not try to climb. He thought the knife was for him. She didn't correct him. She did not know how. She did not know how to explain that the knife was not for him. It was for him. The memory that kept her frozen, the one she had never spoken of, came to her one afternoon at Aunt Delia's. She was sorting a box of ribbons, a donation from a rancher's wife. Her hand closed on a simple, bright red satin ribbon. She was not in Three Creeks. She was back. She was standing in the dry yard of Mr. Gideon's farm. A young farmhand, a boy named Thomas, barely 17, had been helping her carry water. He was a kind boy with a simple smile. He had found a ribbon in the dust, a red one, probably fallen from a passing wagon. He had picked it up, brushed it off, and handed it to her. "For your hair, ma'am," he had said, blushing. "It matches your lips." It was a clumsy, innocent compliment. Miriam had smiled, a small, tired smile. Mr. Gideon had seen it. He had seen the smile. He had seen the ribbon. He had not yelled. He had not struck her. He had been terrible and calm. He had waited until supper. He had told Thomas to stay. He had quoted scripture. He had spoken of vanity, of adultery of the heart, of the weakness of women and the wickedness of temptation. And then, to cleanse the sin from his farm, he had taken a butcher knife from the kitchen. He had told Miriam to watch. The boy, Thomas, had begged. He had cried. Mr. Gideon had been implacable. He had seen it as his righteous duty. He had slit the boy's throat right there at the supper table. He had made her watch. He had held her chin, forcing her to see the life drain from the boy's eyes. "This," he had said, his voice quiet, "is the price of vanity. This is the cost of a smile you do not give to your husband." Miriam's hands were shaking so hard she dropped the box of ribbon. "Child, child, what is it?" Aunt Delia's voice pulled her back. Miriam was breathing in short, harsh gasps. "Nothing, just a chill." She knew, then, why she kept the knife. She knew why she could not touch Luke. She knew why his kindness felt like a trap. Love, in her world, was a prelude to violence. A smile was a death sentence. 2 weeks later, the morning sickness began. At first, she thought it was the beans, or bad water. But after 3 days of heaving up her breakfast into the bushes behind the cabin, she knew. The cold knot of fear in her belly became a living, icy terror. Pregnant. She was pregnant. She did not know when, the night by the fire, that one time, it was enough. She did not feel joy. She did not feel wonder. She felt trapped. It was a chain. It was Mr. Gideon's final victory, a mark he had left on her. Or it was Luke's, a chain to bind him to her. She hid it. She took to waking before him, slipping out to be sick in the pre-dawn cold. She would rinse her mouth in the creek, chewing on mint leaves to hide the smell. She grew thinner, the food not staying down. Her face grew gaunt, her eyes larger. She became brittle, her words sharp. She was a cornered animal. Luke saw it all. He saw the sickness. He saw the new, raw terror in her. He tried to bridge the gap. "Miriam," he said one night, his voice gentle, "you are sick. Let me fetch Aunt Delia. She knows herbs." "I am fine," she snapped, her back to him. "Leave me be." "You are not fine. You are white as a sheet. You are wasting away." "So what? What is it to you?" "What is it to me?" His voice was low, laced with a pain she was too afraid to hear. "You are what is it to me?" She turned on him, her fear twisting into a cruel, lashing anger. Am I yours? Luke, is that it? You saved me. So now you own me? You think because of that night that you have a right to my sickness, to my body?" She saw him flinch. He knew. He had put it all together. The sickness, the timeline. He knew. His face, the good side, went pale. The scarred side was just a mask. "Miriam," he whispered. "That is not I just want to help." "Help?" she laughed, a high, thin sound that bordered on hysteria. "Help is just another word for control. I had a man who wanted to help me. He wanted to save my soul. Is that what you are doing, Luke? Are you my new master?" The word hit him like a physical blow. "Master?" She saw the life go out of his good eye. She saw the man who had laughed, the man who had gentled horses, the man who had confessed he just wanted to be wanted, disappear. He was replaced by the man she had first met, the cold, empty stranger. He did not speak. He did not defend himself. He just looked at her, a long, terrible look of such profound hurt that it cut through her anger. Then he turned, picked up his hat, and walked out of the cabin. The door closed, not with a slam, but with a quiet, final click. She stood there, shaking. The cruelty of her own words echoed in the small room. She had taken his deepest wound, his fear of being a monster, and she had pressed the knife right into it. She sank onto the bed, clutching the pillow. She waited for him to come back. She waited for him to yell, to hit her. It was what men did. He did not come back. The night stretched on. She heard the saloon get loud, then quiet. She clutched the dagger under her pillow, her knuckles white. She was alone again. She had done it. She had driven him away. The gray light of dawn was filtering through the cracks in the walls when the door finally opened. He stumbled in. He was a ruin. His shirt was torn, his knuckles were split and bloody, his good eye was swollen shut, and a fresh cut was bleeding on his chin. He smelled of whiskey and dirt and the saloon floor. He had not just been in a fight. He had been in a war. He had clearly walked into the saloon and started it, needing to feel a pain he could understand. He stood there, swaying, looking at her where she sat on the bed. She expected anger. She expected accusations. He just looked at her, his one open, bruised eye full of a terrible sadness. He tried to take a step, and his legs buckled. He did not fall, but he sank to his knees on the rough plank floor. He knelt before her, not as a penitent, but as a man who had nothing left to stand on. He looked up at her, this broken, scarred killer. "I am not him," he whispered, his voice thick with pain and whiskey. "I am not a master." He took a ragged, shuddering breath. "If you want me gone, Miriam," he said, his voice clear, even as he bled on her floor, "say the words. Say go, and I will. I will walk out of this town, and I will not come back. But I will not be another man who leaves you just because you are afraid." Her world shattered. This was not Mr. Gideon. This was not her father. He was not here to punish her. He was not here to control her. He was giving her the choice. His willingness to leave was the only thing on earth that could have made her want him to stay. The wall she had built, the ice around her heart. It did not just crack, it broke. She dropped the dagger. It clattered to the floor, and neither of them looked at it. A sob tore out of her, the first one she had truly let go. It was a sound of such complete desolation it frightened her. "I am pregnant," she choked out, the words tasting like poison. "I am pregnant. I did not know what to do. I am so afraid." She was sobbing now, the words tumbling out, incoherent. "I am so afraid. He will find me, he will find it, and he will, and you, I thought you would be trapped. I thought you would hate me. I thought you would be disgusted." She looked at him, her vision blurred with tears. "I do not know how, Luke, I do not know how to be this. I do not know how to love anyone. I never asked for this. I never asked for you." He just knelt there, taking it all. He absorbed her fear, her confession, her cruel honesty. He did not judge. He did not flinch. When she was finished, gasping for breath, he slowly, so slowly, reached out one of his bloody, broken hands. He did not touch her face. He did not touch her body. He just laid his hand on her knee, a simple, solid weight. He met her eyes, his own full of a pain that matched hers. "Then I will wait," he said, his voice quiet and final. "I will wait, until you ask for me again." The cabin became a quiet, fragile space. Luke's bruised face healed, the swelling going down, leaving a yellowish tint around his good eye. He did not go back to the saloon. He went to the livery, worked the horses, and came back at dusk. He would bring his pay, placing the coins on the small table. He would take his share for the saloon, for his own food, and leave the rest. "This is for what is needed," he said, his voice rough. He would not say baby. Miriam, in turn, stopped fighting the sickness alone. She would be ill in the mornings, and when she came back inside, he would have a cup of hot, weak tea waiting for her. He did not fuss, he did not pry, he just waited. He slept on the floor, on a bedroll he had bought from Silas. He never again took the bed. He was giving her the room, the space, the choice, in every way he knew how. He was keeping his promise. They lived this way for 2 weeks, like two circled wagons, allied but separate. The fear that had lived in Miriam's belly, the cold knot, was still there. But it was joined by something else, a new, fragile warmth. She would watch him from the window, watch his patient, limping walk, and the hard shell around her heart began to feel thin. The news came, as it always did, from the trading post, and Aunt Delia was the one who brought it. She came to the cabin at midday, which was unusual. She did not knock. She just pushed the door open, her face a mask of worry. Miriam was at the table, mending one of Luke's torn shirts. "You got to pack," Aunt Delia said. "No preamble. Both of you, right now." Miriam looked up, the needle freezing in her hand. "What is it?" "He is here, not here, in 3 Creeks, but in Laramie. And he is asking, a man named Gideon." Miriam's blood went cold. She could feel the color drain from her face. "He came in on the train," Aunt Delia said, talking fast, her hands twisting in her apron. "He has got that same warrant, but he is telling a new story now. He is telling folks his wife was unwell, that she was confused, that she was stolen from him." Aunt Delia looked at Miriam, her kind eyes full of pity and fear. "And he is telling them she is with child, his child. He's hiring men. He's offering $100 for her return, and for the man who is keeping her from him. He is coming. Child. He is coming for his wife and his child." "His child?" The words were a violation. "You got to run," Aunt Delia urged. "Take the Old North Trail, up into the high country. You can lose yourselves there. Silas will give you the horses. Go, now, before he gets here." Miriam looked down at the shirt in her lap. Luke's shirt. She thought of the cold. She thought of the mud, the sleet, the terror of that journey. She thought of being hungry and hunted. She thought of the child inside her, a tiny, fragile thing, and the idea of dragging it through that same wilderness made her feel sick. She thought of Mr. Gideon, his calm face as he slit Thomas's throat, his quiet, righteous voice, his hands. She put the shirt down on the table. She folded it. "No," she said. Aunt Delia stared. "Child, what are you saying? He will kill that man of yours. He will drag you back. You heard the stories. He has got the law." "It is a false law," Miriam said. Her voice was not loud. It was quiet and cold and clear. It was a voice she had never used before. "It is a lie, like he is a lie." She stood up. She was thin. She was pale. She was sick every morning. But she was not the same woman who had been thrown out of Laramie. "I have run from him for 2 years, she said, looking at Aunt Delia. "I ran from my father. I ran from the widow. I will not run from men like him any more. Not now." "Miriam," Aunt Delia pleaded. "Thank you, Delia. You are a good friend, but this is my home, this cabin. He is not welcome here." Aunt Delia saw the set of her jaw, the look in her eye, and she knew it was useless. She just nodded, her face grim. "Then may the Lord you do not believe in find a way to help you, because you are going to need it." She left, and Miriam was alone. She went to the door and looked toward the livery. She could just see Luke, talking to Silas. She stayed at the door. She waited. When he came back an hour later, he knew. The news had moved through the settlement like a grass fire. He stopped on the small porch, his face dark, his good eye searching hers. "Delia was here," he said. "Yes." "She told you to run." "Yes." He waited. He was giving her the choice. He would go. If she asked, he would stay. If she asked. "I am not running. Luke," she said. He did not look relieved. He did not look angry. He just looked steady. He had spent his whole life running from the fire, from Missouri, from himself. Her words settled something in him. "All right," he said, and it was the simplest, most final word she had ever heard. "Then we prepare." He did not go to the saloon to get drunk. He did not pick a fight. He went to the trading post. He took all of his savings, and all of hers. He bought a new box of cartridges for his rifle. He bought a sack of flour. And he bought a used, reliable-looking Navy revolver. He brought it back to the cabin and laid it on the table. "You need to know how to use this," he said. Miriam stared at it. The heavy, dark metal. The smell of oil and black powder. It was a thing of death. It was a man's tool. "I cannot," she whispered. "Luke, I have never—" "I know," he said, his voice practical, stripped of all emotion. "That is why I am teaching you. He is coming for you, Miriam. He is coming for the child. I might not be enough. You have to be able to protect yourself." He took her out behind the cabin, where the land sloped down to the creek. He set up 2 tin cans on a log. He showed her how to hold it. The weight of it surprised her. It took 2 hands to keep it steady. He showed her how to load it, how to pull the hammer back. "It will kick," he said, standing behind her. He was not touching her, but she could feel his heat. "It will be loud. Do not be afraid of it. Just point, squeeze. Do not jerk." She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. It slammed her shoulder back, and she stumbled, dropping the gun. Her ears rang. She had not even been close to the cans. She was shaking, her eyes full of tears. I cannot! "Yes, you can," he said, his voice hard. He picked up the gun and handed it back to her. "Load it." She fumbled with the cartridges, her hands trembling so badly she dropped one. "Again," he commanded. She loaded it. She raised it. She fired. This time she was ready for the kick. But she missed again, the bullet kicking up dirt 10 feet to the left. Again. They stayed out there for an hour. She fired and reloaded and fired again. Her hands were raw. Her shoulder ached. She was clumsy. And she was afraid. But she was determined. She thought of Mr. Gideon's face. She thought of his hands on her. She fired. One of the tin cans jumped into the air. She stood there, breathing hard, the smoke from the pistol curling around her. Luke nodded, a single, small sign of approval. "It is enough. You will not be aiming for a can. You will be aiming for a man. At 10 feet, you will not miss." They went back to the cabin. They did not just wait. They worked. Luke boarded up the back window, leaving just a small crack to see through. He took the heavy kitchen table and braced it against the door. "He will not knock," Luke said. "He will come at night, and he will come fast." Miriam took the old, empty tin cans from the beans and flour. She filled them with pebbles. She tied them with the thread Aunt Delia had given her, stringing them across the path to the cabin, just low enough to be missed in the dark. "A warning," she said. Luke looked at her, and his good eye held a flicker of something new. respect. They set one last trap. Luke took a loose floorboard near the front window, a place where a man might try to climb in. He drove 3 long, rusted nails up through the bottom of it, their points hidden just under the surface. He replaced the board. It looked normal, but it would not hold a man's weight. Then there was nothing left to do. They sat in the dark cabin. The fire was out. The air was cold. Luke sat in a chair by the door, his rifle across his knees. Miriam sat on the bed, the heavy revolver in her lap. The silence was absolute. The waiting was its own kind of torture. "Luke," she whispered into the dark. "I am here. If he comes, he will not touch you," he said. The words were a vow. "I will not let him." "If he kills me, Luke," she said, and the words were hard to get out. "If he gets me, you do not let him take the child." He did not answer for a long time. She heard him take a single, deep breath. "He will not get you," he said, "or the child. I will not fail. Not again." They waited. The sound came just after 2 in the morning. A low clink-clank from outside. The pebbles in the tin cans. Luke did not move. He just raised his rifle, pointing it at the door. Miriam's heart felt like it had stopped. She could not breathe. She raised the pistol with both hands, pointing it at the boarded-up window. "Miriam Gideon!" a voice boomed from the darkness. It was him, that same righteous, terrible voice. "You are in there with that sinner. The law is here. Open this door in the name of God." "Stay away, Gideon!" Luke yelled, his voice a low growl. "This is not your home." "It is my home. That is my wife. She is my property. You will release her, or you will burn in hell." There was a heavy thud as a boot hit the door. The wood splintered. "Now!" Luke roared. A man's shoulder hit the door. The table brace groaned. Another hit, the wood splintered. Luke did not wait. He aimed just to the left of the door handle and fired the rifle. The explosion filled the tiny cabin. It was followed by a high, wet scream from outside. "He has shot Amos!" another voice yelled. "Break it down!" Gideon screamed, his voice pure fury. "Kill the man! Get me my wife!" The door burst open, the table sliding back. A man lunged in, a dark shape against the paler night. Luke did not hesitate. He fired again. The man was thrown backward, collapsing onto the porch, his chest a dark ruin. He did not move. Luke was already working the rifle lever, ejecting the spent shell. At the same time, another man smashed the front window. He tried to climb in, his hands grabbing the sill. He put his foot down on the loose floorboard. The nails went straight up through his boot. He screamed, a sound of pure agony, as he fell forward, his leg trapped, his hands flailing. Miriam, who had been pointing at the window, saw him. He was a young man, younger than her, his face twisted in pain. She did not think, she just acted. She pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening. The man screamed again, a different sound this time, and clutched his thigh, where a dark stain was already spreading. He fell back out of the window, dragging his trapped foot, and lay howling on the ground. 2 men down, 1 dead. The cabin was full of smoke. Miriam was coughing, her ears ringing. And then he was there. Mr. Gideon. He had come in behind the first man, using him as a shield. He was not carrying a gun. He was carrying a long, heavy cane. He saw Luke, who was bringing the rifle around. He saw Miriam, who was staring, paralyzed, at the man she had just shot. Gideon lunged, not at Luke, but at her. He was screaming, his face purple with rage. "Harlot! Abomination! You will obey me!" He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her off the bed. The pain was blinding. The pistol flew from her hand. "She is mine!" he shrieked, dragging her toward the broken door. "She is my property! She belongs to me!" Luke raised the rifle. He had a clear shot. His face was the scarred, cold mask of Missouri. He was ready to end it. Miriam, blinded by pain, was being dragged. She saw the glint of the firelight on something on the floor. Her dagger, the one she had dropped that morning. Her hand shot out, her fingers closing around the worn leather hilt. Gideon was pulling her, his other hand raised to strike her. She did not scream. She did not cry. She twisted, a raw, desperate animal movement, and drove the knife upward, into his side, just below the ribs. She put all her weight, all her fear, all her hatred, into it. He stopped. His eyes went wide. He made a sound, a low, wet gasp. His hand let go of her hair. He looked down at the knife handle protruding from his fine wool coat, a dark stain spreading around it. He looked up at her, his eyes full of shock. He crumpled to his knees, not dead, but broken. Luke was there, the rifle barrel pressed against Gideon's forehead. His finger was tight on the trigger. He was shaking. "No," Gideon whispered, all the righteousness gone, replaced by a child's terror. "Please, in God's name." "God ain't here," Luke snarled. "Luke, stop." He froze. Miriam was on the floor, her hair wild, her face pale, but her eyes were clear. "That is too easy for a man like him," she whispered, her voice ragged. She was breathing hard, but she was not hysterical. She was calm. "Death is a mercy. He does not deserve it. He needs to be seen." Luke stared at her for a long second. He saw the woman she had become. He slowly, very slowly, lowered the rifle. The sun rose on a tableau of carnage. One man dead on the porch. Another, the one Miriam had shot, whimpering in the dirt, his leg crudely bandaged. And Mr. Gideon, tied to a chair with harness rope, his face gray, his side bleeding. The fourth man had fled into the dark. The townspeople came out. They gathered, silent, in front of the cabin. They saw the broken door, the blood. Aunt Delia pushed through, and when she saw Miriam, alive, she let out a low cry and rushed to her. Silas, the livery owner, who also served as the town's part-time sheriff, walked onto the porch. He looked at the dead man. He looked at Luke. He was defending his home. "Silas," Luke said, his voice flat. Silas nodded. He looked at the man Miriam had shot. "And him?" "She was defending herself," Luke said. Silas walked into the cabin. He saw Mr. Gideon tied to the chair, groaning. He looked at the knife wound. He looked at Miriam. "This is the man with the warrant?" Silas asked. "He called her his property," Luke said. "He came in the night to steal her, and the child, he brought these men with him." The word property hung in the air. The people of Three Creeks were squatters, miners, ex-soldiers, and freed men. They were people who had nothing but their own freedom. They looked at Gideon with a new, cold contempt. A woman in the crowd, the trading post owner's wife, who had once looked at Miriam with suspicion, spat on the ground. "Brings hired guns to steal a woman in the night? That ain't law. That is just filth." The public shaming began. Silas and Luke hauled Gideon, still tied to the chair, and the wounded man into the center of the settlement. They left them there. The story was told. The false warrant, the lie about the child, the attack. People did not yell. They just looked. They came and stood and stared at the pious man, bloody and exposed. They saw him not as a righteous husband, but as a coward and a bully. For a man like Gideon, the silent, judging eyes of the community were a far worse fate than a bullet. By nightfall, the federal marshal from Laramie had been sent for. The wounded man had been taken to the doctor. Gideon was locked in a storage cellar. Luke and Miriam returned to the cabin. It was a wreck. The door was gone. The window was shattered. There was blood on the floor. They did not speak. They just worked. Luke found the door and, using the last of the nails, rehung it. It was crooked, but it was a door. Miriam scrubbed the floor, her hands shaking now that the calm had passed. They were both bruised. They were exhausted. They were covered in smoke and grime, but they were alive. When the cabin was as clean as it could be, they sat. Luke sat in his chair. Miriam sat on the bed. The silence was thick, but it was no longer a silence of fear. It was the silence of after. Miriam looked at Luke. He was watching her, his face unreadable in the dim light. He had killed a man for her. He had been willing to kill another. He had honored her choice to stay, and he had stood with her. He was still waiting. She knew what she had to do. The fear was gone. The ghosts of her father, of Mr. Gideon, of Thomas, they were still there. They would always be there, but they were no longer in charge. She stood up from the bed and walked over to him. He watched her, his good eye wary. She knelt in front of him, just as he had knelt in front of her. She took his hands. They were steady. "I never thought," she said, her voice soft and hoarse from the smoke, "I would survive a night like that and still want to be touched." She looked up at him, her eyes clear and raw and honest. "But I do, only by you," she had asked. He did not pull her up. He did not kiss her. He just turned his hands over and laced his fingers with hers. He held her hands, and she held his. They just knelt there, in the ruins of their cabin, in the beginning of their life. The marshal came and went. Mr. Gideon, shamed and no longer righteous, was taken back to Laramie, along with the man he had hired. The dead man was buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of town. The story of the Siege of 3 Creeks, as some called it, settled into local lore, and for the first time, Miriam was not a harlot or Gideon's runaway. She was Miriam, the woman who had stood her ground. The cabin was repaired, but it was too small, and the memories it held were too sharp. The blood was gone, but the shadows remained. "A child needs a proper room," Luke said one evening. It was the first time he had spoken of the baby as a real, future person. He had saved every coin. Silas, the livery owner, felt he owed Luke for his part in running Gideon out. He gave Luke a small plot of land up the creek, set back against a low rise, sheltered from the wind. And the town helped. The same people who had looked through Miriam when she first arrived now saw her as one of their own. They were a community of outcasts, and she and Luke had proven they were tougher than most. Silas brought lumber from a torn-down army barracks. The trading post owner, whose wife had spat in the dust for Miriam, gave them credit for nails, glass for a real window, and a small, used cook stove. And Aunt Delia came, every day. She sat with Miriam, who was growing larger now, her sickness fading as the child grew, and they sewed curtains. Luke built the house. He was not a carpenter, but he was patient. He worked from sunup to sundown, his limp pronounced from exhaustion, but he did not stop. He built a house with 2 rooms. It was solid. It was square. He built the door frame strong, and he hung the door himself, checking 3 times to make sure it was level. As Miriam's belly grew round and high, Luke's evenings changed. He would come back from the livery, wash his face, and eat the supper Miriam had cooked. Then, he would sit on the porch of the new half-built house. He had a block of pine, and he began to carve. He was not a carver, any more than he was a carpenter. His hands were large and rough, but with the small knife he always carried, he worked. He was making a cradle. He spent hours on it, sanding the wood with a piece of broken sandstone until it was smooth as river water. He carved a small, simple star on the headboard. Miriam would watch him from the doorway. He was still a man of few words, but he no longer needed them. The cradle, the solid walls, the new lock on the door. These were his sentences. This was his answer. And, as he had promised, he waited. But he no longer slept on the floor. The new house had a new bed, a real one, with a mattress stuffed with fresh straw and dried lavender from Aunt Delia. He slept beside her now. He did not touch her with desire. It was not what she needed yet. But every night, he would lie on his side, his body a warm, solid line against her back, and he would lay his large, calloused hand on her rounded belly. Sometimes, he would lie awake for hours, his hand spread wide, just feeling the strange, small movements of the life inside her. His hand was not a master's. It was not a guardian's. It was an anchor. It was the first time in her life Miriam had ever felt truly safe in the dark. The land, however, had not healed. It was not a place of forgiveness. Summer came on hard and fast, a dry, baking heat that turned the creek to a trickle and the grass to brown tinder. The rattlesnakes, which had been quiet in the cold, came out in force. Miriam, heavy with the child, was hanging laundry on the line behind the new house when she saw one. It was coiled by the porch step, its tail a dry, furious buzz in the stillness. The old Miriam would have frozen, or fled. She did not move. She just watched it. She was not a guest in its world anymore. She was a resident. She picked up a heavy stone from the yard, walked steadily until she was 10 feet away, and threw it. She missed, but the snake, startled, uncoiled and slid away into the rocks. She went back to hanging her laundry. When Luke came home, she just said, "Snake was by the porch. I think it lives under the rise." Luke nodded. He took his rifle, and he spent the evening patiently hunting it. He came back with the dead snake, its rattles in his hand. He did not make a show of it. He just solved the problem. They were a team. They faced the land, and its small, daily threats of drought and wildfire and venom, together. Their new standing in the town was tested in August. A church elder from Cheyenne, a circuit rider, came to 3 Creeks. He was a thin, severe man with eyes that saw sin in every shadow. He heard the story of Miriam and Luke. He heard of the baby, born of that union. He came to the house. Luke was at the livery. Miriam was alone, sitting on the porch, trying to catch a non-existent breeze. He stood in the yard, his black hat in his hands. He would not step onto the porch. "Mrs. Gideon," he began, and Miriam's back went stiff. "My name is Miriam," she said, her voice flat. "Miss Miriam, I have come on a hard errand. The town, it speaks of you, of your ordeal, but also of your situation, living here, with this man, unmarried, with a child coming." Miriam just looked at him. She did not help him. He cleared his throat. "I have spoken with folks in Laramie. I know your history. Your husband is in prison, as he should be, but you are still a woman living in sin. You were branded as such before, and you are living as such now." "What is it you want, sir?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Forgiveness," he said, his eyes lighting up. "Salvation. The church is merciful. The community is merciful. If you will come to the meeting tonight and repent, if you will confess your sins, your past, and the sin of your current arrangement, God will forgive you. The community will wash you clean. You can be forgiven." Miriam looked at him. She looked at his starched white collar, his earnest, narrow face. He was not Mr. Gideon. He was not a monster. He was just a man who thought he was saving her. In his own way, he was just as dangerous. She stood up, a slow, heavy movement. She rested one hand on her belly. "Forgiveness?" she said, and her voice was not sharp or angry. It was just tired. "You want me to repent? For what? For being sold by my father? For being beaten? For running? For being hunted?" She took a step toward him. He actually flinched. "I have spent my whole life being told I was unclean. By my father. By men in towns I do not remember. By that thing in Laramie. And now by you." She looked out at the dry, brown hills. "I lived through a winter that should have killed me. I survived an attack that should have killed me. I am building a home with my own 2 hands. And this child is not a sin. This child is a miracle." She turned her eyes back to him, and they were clear as water. "I have forgiven myself, sir," she said, "and that is more than your God ever taught me how to do. Now, please get off my land." He left. He never spoke to her again. When the story was repeated in the saloon, Luke just nodded. "That sounds like her," he said, and bought a round for Silas. The rains came in late September. Not a gentle rain, but a cold, driving deluge that broke the drought and turned the world to mud again. Miriam was in the last weeks of her pregnancy, her body swollen and clumsy, her back a constant ache. She was standing at the window, watching the rain. When Luke came home, he was soaked to the bone, his boots caked in mud. He saw her standing, her hand pressed to the small of her back. He did not say anything. He just walked over to her, kicked off his muddy boots, and lifted her. She let out a small gasp, her arms instinctively going around his neck. He was so strong. He carried her to the rocking chair by the stove, the one Aunt Delia had given them. He set her down gently. He knelt in front of her and began to unlace her shoes. "Luke," she whispered, her voice thick. He looked up at her, his scarred face close to hers, his good eye full of a quiet, steady warmth. She clutched the front of his damp shirt. "Do you remember that night at the Haskins Ranch? In the kitchen?" He nodded. His face tightened. He remembered. "I said those words to you," she whispered, shame washing over her. "You want control?" "I remember," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I was wrong," she said, and the confession was a relief. "I was so wrong. I was just a scared girl, trying to poke a bear. I did not know what I was doing." She held his face, her thumb stroking the rough, good skin of his cheek. "I did not know. What I needed, what I wanted was not control. It was to feel safe enough to give it freely." He closed his eye, leaning his face into her hand. He had no words. He just knelt there, his head bowed, and let her touch him. She went into labor 2 nights later, during a storm. The wind howled, just as it had that first night, but this time it was howling around a house that was strong. Luke had gone for Aunt Delia. He had run, his bad leg be damned. He had run the whole way. It was a long night. It was a hard birth. Miriam screamed. She cursed. She wept. She was terrified. But she was not alone. Aunt Delia was there, her hands firm, her voice a low, steady chant of, "Push, child, push." And Luke was there. He did not leave. He did not wait outside. He stayed at her head. He held her hand, and when she tried to pull away, he held on tighter. When she screamed that she could not, that she was dying, he wiped the sweat from her face and just said, You are the strongest person I know. You can." At dawn, as the wind died down, the cabin was filled with a new sound, a thin, healthy wail. Aunt Delia cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a blanket. "You have got a daughter, Miriam," she said, her voice thick with happy tears. "A fine, perfect girl." She placed the baby in Miriam's arms. Miriam looked down at the small, wrinkled, red face. She looked at the tiny, perfect hands. She had survived. They had survived. She looked up at Luke. He was standing over her, his face a ruin of tear tracks and exhaustion. He looked at the baby, and his hard, scarred mouth softened. He reached out one finger, and the baby's hand, impossibly small, closed around it. She is perfect," he whispered. "What will you name her?" Aunt Delia asked. Cleaning the room, Miriam looked at Luke, and he looked at her. They had never spoken of names. They had been too afraid to, but Miriam knew. She knew what this was. After the beatings, the running, the fear, the violence, the cold, this was the end. This was the unearned, impossible gift. "Grace," Miriam whispered, her voice rough. "Her name is Grace." The winter came, but it was different now. The house was warm. The pantry was stocked. The cradle Luke had built sat near the fire. The final scene is not one of drama. It is one of stillness. It was a cold night. The wind was back, howling across the plains, rattling the one glass window. It was the same wind that had always been there, a sound of loneliness and desolation. But inside, everything was still. The fire in the cook stove cast a low, orange light. Luke sat in the rocking chair, the one he had carried Miriam to. He was not wearing a shirt. The firelight played across his broad back and across the slick, old scars on his face. He was holding the baby, Grace. She was asleep, her small head tucked under his chin. He was rocking her, slow and steady, his good eye closed. He was not a killer. He was not a monster. He was a father. Miriam stood in the doorway between the two rooms, leaning against the frame. She was tired, but it was a good tiredness. She was not the sharp, brittle thing that had arrived in Wyoming. She was not the terrified girl who had held a knife. She was just Miriam. She watched them, her broken man, and her new child, the two halves of her new, mended life. The wind howled, a long, lonely cry. But inside, there was only the sound of the rocking chair, a quiet creak, creak, creak on the floorboards, and the low crackling of the fire. Miriam looked at her daughter, asleep on her father's chest, safe from the wind, and safe from the world. She whispered, so quietly that only she and the child could hear, "You come from broken things that chose to heal." Thank you for listening to this story from the Wild West Campfire channel. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so you can connect with other listeners. And be sure to subscribe and share your thoughts.